Wow, great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming, Blair and Ashley and Diane, to the first Dr Compost session for 2023. I'm going to hand it over to Peter Howard, our Dr Compost, and he's going to answer some of the questions. We'll probably start with the people who are here in person.
Yeah, people who show up to the meeting get priority. What I always like to say about the advantage of having a video format is you can get a bit more detailed about your questions, and it's more of a relaxed format, so I can maybe go into more detail. It's a bit more terse when I'm writing text replies to people. So this is just an offering to the community, and you guys get to know each other a bit by joining in on the forum. So let's go ahead and start in. What questions do you guys have today for me?
Maybe Diane, you've already started sharing, so would you like to?
Yeah, if you want to unmute yourself, Diane, then you can. Yeah.
I was just when I read certain sites, they were just talking about the worm tea. When you soak the worms like that, it's one way, but then some of the composters in Arizona, they actually put the compost and they soak it overnight and oxygenate it and do all of that. And I just was interested in how is it that there are two ways, like Arizona Worm Farm, they have oxygenated tanks and you go down and purchase it. And that was my question.
Okay, so I'll go into that a bit. So what it is when you go to the trouble of oxygenating it and adding molasses, what you're essentially doing is setting up a micro breeding station to amplify the amount of microbes out of your compost. And typically when people set that up, they're liking to dilute it and spread it over a large area. So that's the kind of thing you like to set up when you've got a big area to cover and the soil's been impoverished. Maybe people have used conventional fertilizers and pesticides, and they've really knocked down the soil microbes. Then you want to sort of correct that by drenching with repeated applications of brewed up microbes. But the advantage we have with the Subpod is in a home garden system, you have a really nice diverse array of microbes living in the bedding. The worms actually, one of their jobs is to favor certain soil microbes. So you know that what you're providing to your plants are actually verified, soil beneficial microbes, because that's one of the worm's jobs, is it actually breeds them up in its guts. And so you actually have no need to amplify the amount of microbes that you're going to extract directly from the compost. And what I like to do is basically get a mesh bag, get a few handfuls directly out of the Subpod, worms and all, and you massage that into a bucket of water. You'll see the water turning brown right away, releasing all those soluble nutrients and microbes directly into the water. And then you quickly return the worms from the bag back into the Subpod, mix that back into the bedding. And if you're a gardener who's really passionate about growing your plants in a healthy way, you can do this every week. Just turn it into a ritual. I did this last year where I would once a week make a quick extract like this, and water my plants. And then to your question about adding extra goodies. So you can add a bit of seaweed extract to that, because there's reasons to sort of benefit the mixture with the trace minerals that the seaweed can provide, and then fish emulsion to add a bit of extra nitrogen. So what I typically like to do is make the extract from the compost first, return the worms back, and then add those goodies to the extract that you've made. That way you're not sort of dumping fish emulsion and seaweed directly on the worms, which might stress them out a bit. So that works really well. And I was mentioning that you can foliar feed your plants, especially vegetables that you cook. They'll take up the nutrients directly from the tissue of the plant. So it saves time over having to absorb them from the soil and pull them up through the plant. So you'll see within a couple days, if you do a foliar feed, feeding the leaves, you'll see the plants respond, getting greener and brighter within a couple days of doing that. That said, if you have lettuces and stuff you're planning to harvest for a salad in a couple of days, they might smell a little fishy. if you foliar feed with seaweed extract. So if you're planning to eat a salad within a couple days of the feeding, I would water around the roots rather than the leaves for that.
Just to add to that, I put the fish emulsion on my lettuce, and then I smelled it and it was terrible. And then I texted Greenie's Garden. I'm like, now what do? I don't like the fish. And they go, well, just wash it a lot of times.
Yeah. Yeah, you can do that, but you save the hassle of doing that by just watering at the base. And if you're doing it, say, for example, if you buy a lettuce seedling or you're starting your seeds, your lettuce from seeds, then the fish emulsion is fine for, the first weeks of getting them going. And then you'll notice that fish smell will subside after a week or a week and a half. And so then you can just start doing it at the base instead. And depends, if you like to pick leaves off of a lettuce, then yeah, you're probably better off. For plants that you're eating raw, is feeding at the base, if you're going to add fish emulsion. The other thing is the brown color of the extracted compost can leave spots on the leaves. If like I've done this foliar feeding to broccoli, and I like to add it to the leaves around the broccoli head rather than directly on the head of the broccoli, because it can create spots on the head of the broccoli, which may bug you. So these are all subtleties you'll discover as you start to use the stuff. But it's really nice. It's satisfying to use it because you're basically creating a valuable resource with that waste food scrap. And another benefit is that you end up gradually using your compost, providing a little at a time to the plants. And so it takes longer for it to totally fill up, which means that, every half year or 9-month project of separating worms from compost is postponed a bit longer.
Okay, we've got a hand up from Blair. Hopefully that's helpful,
Yeah.
Diane.
Hi there. How are you guys tonight?
Good, good.
So
Where are you, Blair?
thank you to Jen for customer support. I had messaged you guys on Instagram last night, and we've been emailing back and forth. That's how I got the link to the Zoom tonight. So,
Right.
Question for, so we had a Subpod, the regular, and one in our raised beds last year in our home. We've moved to a condo. Now I have a small screened in porch, and I've been looking at the balcony option that you all have with the raised planter.
Yeah.
Can you just, it feels very daunting to even take on the idea of trying to do this in a small condo and a screened in porch versus in a yard. Can you walk me through what are the differences? How does it kind of work on a screened in porch in a tiny space?
Okay, yeah. So I've been working with my Modbed, which is that modified system for balconies, in a fairly low light situation. And I quickly realized that it works fantastic for composting. So basically, I have a mini in that, and I'm able to put exactly the same amount of food waste into the mini with just that small amount of soil around it, and it's working really well. If you're going to grow plants around the Modbed, which it's a shame not to, because there's the plants love to sort of grow their roots into the walls of the mini, and then they'll just power. You'll probably want to get a bit of lighting to augment the kind of diminished light you would have on a screened-in porch. So I've been working with the production team here that's developing the new products. We're coming up with our own grow light. It'll be one of the next products we release. We've got a frame over the top of the Modbed. So in the meantime, if you got a Modbed for that situation, then you could certainly start by doing the composting and then have a little patience. And then we have this great setup to put on the top of it, where it's basically some uprights where you can add a greenhouse and a mesh kind of house, protection mesh, and a trellis for growing little plants up the back. So we're trying to create the most food capacity you can in a small space. And then it rewards people because even if you're downsizing to a condo where you don't have a yard, you'll really be able to get the pleasure and satisfaction of growing food at your table still. And then the other thing I'll just say in advance, I've been working on a microgreen project. So because you're investing in a light, you'd want to be able to use that space on the lid of the Mini. So putting a tray and sprouting your own microgreens and sprouts in there will be the next step. And of course, you can water those with the extracts from the Subpod compost. So it's going to be.
Oh, go ahead. Excuse me.
No, go ahead. What's your question?
So the other question, like a follow-up, is if the porch doesn't get a lot of light, can you just use the Modbed for compost only and not trying to grow the vegetables?
Yes.
Like there's a very
Yes.
shaded part of the porch that I could just tuck it over there.
Perfect.
Are the worms going to be like crawling out of the?
No, it's they're
to my
fine.
neighbors
So
below, or like anything crazy?
yeah, no, it's fine actually. So when you think about where these compost worms live in nature, they're actually living under the leaf litter layer in the forest. So they normally don't like light. They actually want to avoid light, get away from light. That's the reason we have the worm blanket on top of the compost. So they'll be utterly fine with low light. In fact, they'll thrive, under those conditions.
And with like hurricane season down here, which is very common for us, for something like that, when our HOA requires that we bring everything in from the porch, like, can I roll that thing into my, like, will the worms stay? Will they be okay? Or
Yes. So you might have
enough to think about before.
Okay, no, it's true. It's good you're thinking in advance. These are all great things to figure out in advance. So I've been using soilless media rather than heavy soil around the Mini in that Subpod Modbed because it's much lighter weight. And so it's easier to move it around. So if you have a threshold between the screened-in porch and your room directly inside, you might have to lift it slightly to get it over the lip of the track of your sliding door. And by using a soilless media, you can lift one end and roll, and then lift the other end and roll, and it'll be fine. I've moved mine around, and it's doable. And the worms will be fine with that. They're happily inside.
What is this soilless media? What is this that you're talking about?
Oh, so I'm assuming that on your screened-in porch.
No, soilless media.
Oh, soilless media. So it's really like potting mix.
Okay.
So if you go to the garden center and you say, I want a potting mix that's just for container plants, that's not garden soil, then usually that's a mixture of things that hold moisture well, drain well. For example, things like vermiculite and perlite, and maybe coconut coir. I make up my own mixture, which is 50% coconut coir and about 20% vermiculite, 20% perlite. And what that'll do is it'll provide a nice insulation for the worms. It'll create moisture for them. And if someday it works out to add grow lights and grow plants, the plants will do very well in that as well.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
And you just probably wouldn't give it a big water if you had it inside. You might end up with a bit of water.
Well, to that last point, you want to put a tray in that so that there's a bottom shelf that sits below it. And so think of it as though you've got like a house plant, you've got a little saucer underneath it. You're always careful not to overwater the plant. When you start to see water going into the saucer, you'd stop watering. And you have the same principle here where you just put a tray in that lower shelf and keep from over. But you honestly, you won't need to water at all if you're not growing plants in it. I did the experiment on my Modbed where I put in the soilless media, and I literally, just as an experiment, didn't water it at all. And the worms were fine inside.
Food waste has moisture in it.
But if you have plants in there, you're watering based on what the plant needs.
Yeah.
In there. Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Does Subpod make a tray that goes underneath that, or do you have a recommendation? Is it?
We don't sell a tray that exactly fits into that, but I would think of it as like a saucer that you would have under a pot plant or potted plant, but something that's not too deep, that will catch just the drips. Because when you first saw any drips, you'd stop watering, and then that would dry out and it'd be fine.
Okay.
So yeah, something that more or less fills the whole shelf would be ideal. I mean, if need be, you could just put in some kind of builder's plastic that you could roll and fill the space with if you can't find a tray that fits the exact space. I'll talk to the team more about the possibility of creating a custom tray that could fit into that. So that
I know it's on the whiteboard.
yeah, it's one of the things to come.
Any smells with, I mean, we didn't experience it with having the regular Subpod because we were outside.
Yes. Yeah,
Any
it's this. It's I'm not finding any trouble at all. There's no real difference with the mini in the Modbed, and it should be fine. You just make sure that you're aerating when you're adding your food scraps, so you're keeping things fluffed up. But it's really designed to keep things aerobic and keep the compost sweet smelling, so it should be fine.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I just
Thanks,
wanted to.
Blair.
Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
now Ashley, I just thought we'd just check in and see if Ashley had something.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hey.
Hey there. So I'm in Austin, Texas. We started our Modbed Mini back in November.
Right.
I didn't realize that the worms didn't like the cold. So I got it thinking like, oh, it's going to be great all winter. We're fine. And my husband was quickly like, oh no, under 50, they're going to be upset. So we kind of slowly fed them the first 6 weeks, and we noticed some mold in the Subpod. We pulled it out pretty quickly, but I wanted to know if that was common or were we just messing up?
No, it's pretty common. I mean, you're going to have mold spores on food scraps, and it's part of the diverse ecosystem inside of the mini that you'll just get an array of microbes, and they're playing an important role of breaking down the food. One of the unsung heroes of the composting world is fungus, and molds are a fungus. Is they're really good about breaking down very woody waste, like the tougher stalks of food and things like that. They're better at that than bacteria, and so having a little bit of fungi in there is fine, and it's no problem for the worms. If you're starting to see a lot of it, it's often a sign that it's a bit over wet, and so you'd want to add a bit more carbon inside the system. But were you seeing the mold inside the mini, or were you seeing it in the soil around the mini?
It was inside the mini on the top. It seemed like, maybe one of the banana peels or something. We were putting some coffee grounds in there too, just to get them more carbon, to keep them warmer. So maybe there was just like too much moisture from the coffee grounds and the water all together. But I was worried. I was like, oh no, are we molding you? Are we poisoning you?
Don't worry. The worms are fine with that. They expect to find mold in their natural habitat. So good question. Yeah, it's interesting you knew about the coffee grounds. So they're actually, even though they're brown, they're more of a nitrogen source than a carbon source. And they play that great role that you've mentioned of heating things up. So when the weather gets colder, by putting in coffee grounds, you'll raise the temperature just a little bit. And so the worms will handle colder air temperatures by creating a bit more heat in the inside of their chamber of the Subpod.
Okay, cool. And just second question before we go up to the others. How small do I need to be making the pieces of food? Because I have a neighbor in my gardening group here in Texas who has worms, and she purees her food for the worms, and I am not pureeing my food for the worms. So.
Not necessary. That's really above and beyond to do that. But the only time you would really think about doing that is, let's say you live in an area where worms are scarce and they only sell you like 500 worms at a time. My analogy is, it's like getting a little glowing ember that you're trying to coax into a fire, and so you're feeding it very carefully to get the flame going. So similarly, if you chop up the food really fine, or you puree it really fine, you're releasing a lot more surface area of that food to break down faster. So it's almost like baby food for the worms, where they're getting optimal supply so they can breed up quickly. But honestly, once you have your system going, people get way more relaxed about the size of the food scraps. And really what you start to pay attention to is, if you're using the aerator to mix the food in and fluff things up, you chop it up enough so that it doesn't get caught on the tines of the aerator.
Mhm.
And that's about all you need to worry about. I mean, for example, where I live, I can grow passion fruits, and I'll quarter, the halves, so that there's little chunks of piece. And the same with citrus, quartering it up is sufficient. But yeah, you don't need to blend once things are underway.
Okay,
Yeah,
good, I will
it's
not.
just fast. It just makes it faster to get through your food waste. Just,
Yeah,
up to you. How much you can be
Awesome.
bothered
Thank
to chop
you.
things up.
sure.
Okay, I think Diane had another question there.
Oh, I was
Did you-
just going to comment on the aerator. I
Mhm.
bought one of yours, but before I started using it, I was just going in with my hands and doing it. And then someone said, well, you're disturbing all the worm stuff. So then I started using the aerator. So if you do fluff it with your hands, they seem to like it. They seemed happy. But and my grandkids like to fluff it, but the
Yeah.
aerators started using the aerator after a year. Like I had it, but I didn't realize it's more not to bother them so much.
Well, if you did it every day, it would bother them. But honestly, the routine I like to get into is if I'm adding food twice a week, I do a good fluffing up of the whole bed every time I'm adding food. So if you do it twice a week, it's not going to bug them too much. And in fact, they'll appreciate it, because if you fluff up their bedding, more air gets in and they're happier. It breaks down the food better, and they can breathe better because they breathe through their skin. And so the more air that's in the bedding, the better off they are. So the advantage you had doing it by hand is twofold. One is you can actually feel the temperature, or the temperature for sure. If it's getting too warm, you can kind of pay attention to that, and also the moisture levels. So you get literally a feel for, is the moisture level right? And then you can get your hands into the corners more easily than the aerator. But the reason the aerator is good is that it's very efficient for both mixing and aerating the whole system. So if you've got a busy life, you can do it quickly, and then you don't have so much gunk to wash off your hands afterwards.
Yeah, it's really, and it's for people who don't want to get their hands in. There's some people that don't want to.
But one more follow-up, how much compost should be in a bin? Mine was actually getting totally full, and the worm
Mhm.
farms, no, they don't want to live in their poop. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, I have like this pod. They go, whatever. But they didn't quite understand it. So I took out like a huge amount and put it in my garden and went down lower. But then I didn't want to go down too low because I thought they'd get cold. So really, how much compost should be in I have a mini.
Okay, so I like to keep it half full or more, and it's full when it gets right up to the aerator panels. So there's advantages of being mostly full, like you're suggesting. It buffers it more from the air extremes. Like if the temperatures are fluctuating strongly day and night, you get really cold nights and hot days. It acts as a bit of a buffer to keep the temperatures more even inside. And so especially it's going to be helpful in the wintertime. It'll keep the worms warmer. It can be an issue if it's really full and you're adding food, and you could start to spill out of the mod bed and create mess that way. So there's that. If it's too full, you can pull some out. And then I do a lot of making extracts. And so that tends to reduce the level. It's not like you dissolve all of the compost in it. But then back to that question you had, or the comment you had from the worm guys saying they don't like to live in their own poop. Well, actually, they're creating their optimal habitat with secreting the castings into the bedding. And as long as you're adding carbon with the food scraps, and there's air getting in there, then they're fine. What could happen over time is if it gets really fudgy and really dense, then you're not getting the air in there, and then they're not as happy when you have a deep chamber like we have for the Subpod. But by adding something like coconut coir as your dry carbon, that has this great fibery structure which creates a lot of surface area and holds the loft of the bedding really well, so that the worms are really happy, and they can eat some of the
You
coconut
have to
coir as well.
You wet the coconut coir, you don't just break it up dry and put it in, you make it
Yeah,
wet.
it's true. Yeah, it comes in a compressed brick typically. Sometimes you can buy these large bales that are pre-moistened, but typically from like Home Depot or places like that, they sell these compressed bricks, and you'd want to rehydrate that and then squeeze out any extra moisture. So you're adding moistened but not wet coconut coir. And I just am a big fan of that material for the worms. And so some people like the idea of adding only waste materials and they want to add paper and cardboard. It's fine to add some paper and cardboard, but what I find is that paper tends to wet down into a sodden mess like paper mache and doesn't hold the air in the bedding as well. So some paper is fine, but I wouldn't rely exclusively on paper for
I'm really
for my
glad you
dry
said
cover.
because mine does the best when I use coconut coir, and I would put in equal amounts with the grandkids. You know, we would put in this one, and then this, and we would aerate it. And to them, I mean, it made sense. And then I did put some cardboard in, but it seems like some of it's still there. And then the worm farm said to put in mulch, and then they're just pieces of wood. They go, we used to use
Yeah.
coconut, but we don't use it anymore. And I figured they stopped using it because it's just expensive.
Yeah, well, and also mulch is pretty woody, and so the worms actually prefer more manageable carbon sources that are easier to break down. So they like thin carbon pieces like raw down leaves and paper and cardboard, and of course the coconut coir, because you put in woody chip and they can't make much use of that. It's actually better to put in the garden bed than it is inside the subpod.
Okay.
So, were there questions on the?
Well, there was questions that were asked in the actual event, so
Mhm.
I don't know if you wanted to just quickly talk to any of those. We had about
Sure.
there was that one from Wendy that she posted not just recently, where she was about bringing the worms inside for winter. She lives in Minnesota.
Oh, yes, I'll go into more detail on that. So this is a case where someone's maybe new to setting up the worm system and they're in really cold northern climates and the temperatures drop down to freezing, and you have a choice. You can either tinker with creating conditions that keep the worms insulated in the winter, and there are great examples out there in the community of people who do clever things, like they'll take egg cartons that they sit on top of the bedding and then put layers to trap still air in, and you can get that to work. But if you're new to it, there's something to be said for bringing it indoors, especially your first year while you're learning things. And so you can easily just at least take some of your worms, put them into say a plastic bin, and bring them into an area like a garage or a shed that stays a bit warmer, and then just keep them there. And this person ran into trouble because they saw some insect eggs that had developed on top of their compost, and they saw that flies hatched out of them, and they wanted to make sure flies weren't getting into their house. And I totally understand that. And so I was suggesting use diatomaceous earth when you see those eggs, scatter that on the eggs. You'll suppress them from hatching and keep that from taking place. But the other thing is they admitted that their system was getting a bit wet. And oftentimes, if you have the coconut coir at the ready and add that in with the food scraps, say you have a bucket of it sitting by the side of your little bin, if you brought it indoors, then you get into the routine of adding a handful of that, and then making sure it doesn't get over wet. Because the two ways where the system can go off is if the food sits at the top and then insects are tempted to colonize it. If you make sure to bury the food under the surface, you have way less trouble with insects getting into the compost. And then also making sure that the moisture levels are sufficiently wet, but not dripping wet. So anyway, I was providing that as a remedy. And the nice thing is that there's different options for people. I'm also imagining someone who has to trudge outside in a blizzard to feed their worms. It's probably a bit easier if you can take some of them inside and feed them, in the cold months of winter.
Okay.
We
And
just
then,
had someone
yeah,
join.
Sarah.
Sarah, if you want to unmute yourself, if you have questions for us. we're giving priority to the people who show up live, and we're recording this for the people who can't make it live.
Hi, I don't have any questions. I'm just listening in.
Oh, okay. Do you have a Subpod at this point, or are you learning more about how it works?
I bought one yesterday, so I'm waiting for it to arrive.
Okay. Well, you're listening in, but what climate are you in? Are you in the US, I'm assuming?
Northeast America, so Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, so you're just starting to come into spring gradually now, I imagine.
Yep, hopefully.
It's a good yeah, it's a good time of year to set it up as the weather's getting a bit warmer. So if you had a way of checking the soil temperature, you can get an idea of what's roughly the bedding temperature of your worms, because people check air temperatures typically, but happily the soil tends to be a bit warmer than the air. And so even if you're getting freezing nights, but the days are starting to warm up, your soil will actually be a bit warmer than that. And so you can start thinking about setting it up. As long as the soil temperature is around 50 or thereabouts Fahrenheit, the worms will be very happy in those conditions.
Great. Well, that's good because you just answered Teresa's question about, do the temps need to be consistently above freezing before I can safely add my worms?
You know, so air temperature is less important than soil temperature. And so if luckily more people have digital thermometers these days, you can just stick in the soil and get an idea of what's happening in the soil. And then your bedding will actually be slightly warmer than that, again, because you have this decomposition activity taking place inside the bedding, which will warm it up a few degrees beyond. So as long as you're out of the hard freezes, but you know, once the system is going, you can keep it year round. We have great images of people pushing snow off the lids of their subpods, opening them up and having the worms active inside.
So yeah, someone in the UK was asking, would you recommend having the subpod in a spot where it has good access to sunshine, given the climate in the UK?
Yes, if that's probably a good idea in the UK. And then if you had one of those crazy heat waves that do
Like
happen
last summer.
occasionally, then you just make sure you had a bit of shade for those times of the year. So generally, what I recommend for people is in generally colder places to put it in a sunnier spot, and in generally hotter places to put in a shadier spot. And that way you don't have to do as much work when you've got the extremes to deal with.
And then she was asking that what's the best soil to put around the garden bed, such as around a classic. It says, can that be compost soil from the garden centre, or does it need to be topsoil?
It's compost soil is actually a good choice, because a lot of people don't realize that compost worms are different from earthworms, and so they tend to live at the top of the soil rather than deep in the soil, and they actually prefer to be above the soil in the leaf litter layer. So compost is a bit closer to what they experience in their natural habitat.
And also, you know, in a raised garden bed, you know, things can become a bit compressed over time because you're always watering from the top, aren't you?
Unless you have a wicking bed.
Yeah, there you go. We're not going to go. We'll do a special wicking bed one sometime. We'll get the guys in.
Yeah.
And do a wicking bed. But yeah, anything that's going to be like a free draining, fairly light soil that allows the roots of the plants to get in amongst it is always, we found, is better. And that coconut core that Peter was talking about, we've had great success here with our little beds where it's got a high percentage of that. Again, holds moisture, creates air in the soil, allows roots.
And here's the other thing is make sure you put a little bit of mulch on top of the soil around the garden bed, because what'll happen is some of those compost worms are going to want to go exploring. They'll check out their habitat around the subpod, and if you have mulch over the top of the soil, they'll travel around the bed, basically providing benefit for all of your plants. They don't disturb growing plants at all, and they'll actually improve the quality of the soil as long as there's mulch on top.
Yeah, it's amazing how many photos I see of our community with just bare soil, and I'm always like, no.
It's a learning curve. You know, people realize that they have to get into the mindset of bare soils, almost like being, you know, naked outside, where you want to protect that soil and keep the soil free from the harsh UV of the sun, keep the microbes happy. So I think it's catching on. Farmers are starting to realize about green manures and all of that.
Well, if
Diane, did you?
if I have all those carrots, then I don't have room for mulch, or do I put mulch between all the green? You know, it's just solid.
If now if you're a really great gardener and you've actually filled the space fully with plants, then you don't need mulch. But if you have any bare spots, and what'll happen typically is if you're starting out, let's say if you grow your carrots from seeds, you would clear a little line of your seeds and then mulch around it, and then over time as the carrot fronds grow up and fill in, that mulch is breaking down and you don't have to add any more. So it's really the rule of thumb is just bare soil covering it with mulch, because it'll dry out less quickly, and you'll end up with better results for the plants.
And you're adding organic matter to the soil. You'll see it disappear, over time into the soil. So you're actually adding more goodies to the soil, and of course the microbes and the worms love it too.
Generally, for garden beds for annuals, you'd want to use a lighter weight mulch like shredded straw or sugar. We have sugar cane in where we live as a choice, and avoid the sort of heavier chips and tan barks and things like that, because they're better suited to under trees and perennials, and use a lighter weight mulch for raised garden beds.
May I ask another
Blair?
question about the Modbed? One of the things, I don't have access to like a water source on my porch. That's something that's necessary to, like, if it gets gross and I need to clean it out. That was one of the questions. And then you had mentioned a few minutes ago about every time you take the compost out, to aerate. Are you putting compost in every day? You said a couple times a week.
Usually, usually a couple times a week. So typically you might have a kitchen caddy where you're collecting your food scraps. You have your food waste, you chop it up into coarse pieces, throw it in the caddy, and then when the caddy's full, I wait until it's completely full before I add it to the Subpod. And in my case, that might be twice in a week that I would do that.
When we had a countertop one, it without fail, I don't know if it's the humidity here or what, but I mean, without fail, we got the gnats and the fruit flies.
Yeah. So here's what I recommend. So we actually sell a kitchen caddy where I made sure that it was designed to be closed top, because all the ones that are being clever with the little, pad of carbon in that, and you see all those eggs of the fruit fly getting laid in there, and then it's full of fruit flies, and you have that entry point. So we made sure to make it solid, and it has a little silicone seal around the lip of the lid, so nothing's getting in there, and you'll prevent fruit fly harvest going.
Is not having a water source an issue out there if there was to be a problem? I mean,
oh,
trouble.
you mean like well, what you would probably do is get a little bit of a plastic bin, that you could put stuff inside of, and then if you had to wash something out there, that would be the easy way. Probably that's what I recommend. Just take some water from the kitchen and wash stuff off. And
so of course you can water with a watering can, but you had to have a bucket of water.
She means if she had messes. She means if she had something to clean up.
Yeah, but also when you're harvesting, what I do is I put a tarpaulin down, and then I put the containers when I'm harvesting on top of the tarp, and then it's easy to clean up. And
you'll only need to do that harvesting once every 6 months to a year, depending on how much you're feeding it. So that's the occasional job, and you can always harvest a little at a time, so it's not a big deal. So I think we're about time.
We've got restless lunch, Subpod lunch people wanting to come and have lunch together.
Any last minute burning questions? Okay, well, and if anything occurs to you guys, go ahead and write up your questions on the chat that I asked Dr. Compost, and I'll be happy to get to them until next week. So good luck, everyone out there.
Yeah, great.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
joining us live. It's so nice to
Nice
have
to
you.
see the community event.
Yeah. See you again next month. We'll be doing that one once a month now. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Happy composting.